Hi, okay. So as Annie said, Emily and I are here to present and talk to you about the opportunities of court watching in Chicago, and we are both at Elmhurst University. So if you have any questions at the end, that's where you would contact us. Next. So a couple things to kind of set the stage for what we're talking about. So today we're talking about, right at this conference, all of the great resources that Chicago has to offer, from the libraries to art to activism, all of these things. And one place that you might not be thinking about within this broader conversation is that it's a functioning city and the criminal justice system is a part of that, and particularly the courts. And so something that you may or may not know are that the courts are public, and with some qualifications. And so what that means is the public and the press have the access to enter the courts at any time because of what is called the open court doctrine. And this right has been upheld by the Supreme Court in a variety of different rulings, saying that the press and the public have the right to attend criminal trials, preliminary hearings, jury selections, all sorts of things like that. And setting the stage, just to note that you can't enter all courts. So things like grand juries and juvenile courts are both closed because they want to protect the privacy of witnesses and the youth. But generally, most courts are open to the public. And one of the things I do encourage students to do with one of my assignments is to talk about what it means to be open, right? Because that can be a very broad interpretation. And that's one of the things I want students in one of the projects I work with to think about. Now, thinking about kind of the use of taking students to the courts, there's a variety of different benefits. Arguably most important, I think, for Emily and I, speaking for on behalf of both of us, is that it really gives you a chance to see the process and the people that are involved and to humanize them. And so importantly, I'm a criminal justice faculty member, and I'm always trying to remind my students, right, that these are people who are involved in the system and we are not our worst deed. Right. And so by actually entering courthouses, we get to see, right, how the process works and individuals at the center of court proceedings. For me, whether it's about the courts alone or broader in the criminal justice system, it's important for them to see kind of how the criminal justice system works, when in many ways it feels like it's kind of this out of reach situation, right, behind closed doors. We know that a disproportionate number of minorities are involved in the criminal justice system. And at Elmhurst, most of our students are white, and we're coming up on Hispanic serving institutions. So just on average, most of our students don't have a full understanding of how the process actually works on a day-to-day. Importantly, it allows for students to visit the city. And so it helps them kind of cross over some of the barriers and the logistics of going new places, right? Whether that's taking mass transit for the first time, figuring out, right, how the schedule works, how to buy a pass, all of those different things. And so like at Elmhurst, right, we're physically close to the city, but there's a huge social gap between Elmhurst and Chicago proper, and even Elmhurst and other suburbs, which I'll talk about. And then importantly, one of the last things that logistically we all need to think about is that there's a low cost, right? The only cost of taking students to the courts is a transportation. So within Chicago, especially, right, it being the third largest city in the US and then having its huge metropolitan area with so many diverse populations, there are a lot of different courts that you can go to. And so I just wanted to highlight a couple. We host federal courts downtown. There are state courts, there are county courts, and then within each of these, they deal with a variety of different crimes and groups. And so there are what are called specialty courts, in addition to misdemeanor and felony courts. And so if you think broadly, right, that there are different courthouses kind of for different levels of government, but then within those, there are tons of different things going on at once. And so I've taken students to a variety of these, including the specialty courts. And so we have visited Veterans Court and drug court. And in fact, we attended Veterans Court graduation, which was an incredible experience. And So I've planned and supervised multiple trips, and then I've attended additional student trips. And so you'll notice that some of those that are listed that I personally have visited are in Chicago proper, and some are in the suburbs, which I'll help to explain kind of what that looks like. And so I've been downtown with groups, and then I've been out to DePage and into Maywood. And so it's been an interesting kind of cross section. Next, thanks. So it's kind of weird to phrase it as an opportunity, but because of all of the court systems that happen within Chicago and the metropolitan area, there are a ton of different opportunities to take students for a variety of different reasons. And so Elmhurst has relatively small class sizes, and so I am able to take full classes to the courts. So I have taken course field trips with entire courses. So if I'm teaching pretty much any criminal justice course it can relate to, but if I often take my criminology class, which is all about the theories of crime, and we'll attend court often in Maywood. And so there's logistical concerns that we're going to talk about later, but these are really powerful experiences for students. As I said, they can be incorporated into any criminal justice class, which is what I teach, but I can imagine taking students in a variety of other courses as well, and Emily is going to spotlight kind of some of what that would look like in different disciplines. Additionally, I've gone with our pre-law club to visit the federal courthouse. And that was a really great and interesting experience because it was actually pre-law club at the federal courthouse in the morning. And then it just so happened to be the same day that Dr. Navarro, that Emily was taking her students to immigration court. And so I went straight from federal court to immigration court. And that juxtaposition was really interesting, and that alone I think could be a really interesting kind of day-long trip, right, to experience kind of back to back what the different courts look like. Even just the security processing that happens at different courts is incredible, right? If you were at the federal courthouse at Dirksen and you had to take your shoes off to go through security, people would lose their minds. But at immigration court, it was like, take your shoes off, like without a doubt, right? Because there's different social capital and different power dynamics at each courthouse. And so just going back to back was a really interesting day, and emotional too, which Emily will talk about. And lastly, and the part I want to focus on the most for this is that at Elmhurst, we have an experiential requirement. And so in order to graduate from Elmhurst, you have to complete some sort of off-campus experience. So that could be an internship, it could be study abroad, it could be courses with an experiential component on it. Or we have what is called EXP 250, which is a 0 credit course that just fulfills this requirement for graduation. So it's kind of like a proficiency. And so in order to complete the course, the basic requirement is that students are required to spend 15 hours off campus. And so it can be an experience off campus, or it can be a service component. So they can be going to like do something for others. And generally we build the EXP 250 to be really flexible, but I think that especially given my student population, right, that many of them are working and things like this, that I wanted to build an experience that would be really useful for them, but wasn't necessarily going to be as large as an internship. And so what I did is I built EXP 250 court watching. And so our students are required to go to watch court for 15 hours. And within that, I require them to visit Maywood's court and Wheaton. So not in Chicago proper, but Maywood and Wheaton. And they have to go, and we have a court call form that they have to go and describe what they saw within those 15 hours of watching court. In addition to their court watching, they're also reading a book called Krieg County. And so it's about racism and injustice in America's largest criminal court. And so Nicole Van Cleve is a faculty member, a sociologist. I think she's at Temple now, but I could be wrong. But while she was at Northwestern, she actually put together a team to do court watching within a variety of different courts to actually pull data on how the courts are processing at 26 in California. And so she looks at kind of the injustices that happen across the courts. And so our students read the book in addition to doing their actual court watching. And then they write an essay reflecting on their experience, right, of court watching with the book, but they also are drawing in Chicago Appleseed Fund for Justice's court standards. And so there's a great organization in Chicago, obviously, that has put together what they think are kind of the best practices for the court. And so thinking about what it means to be open. And so here, they say things like, the trial court conducts its proceedings and other public business openly. It facilitates safe, accessible, and convenient use for all members of the public as well as courtroom participants. It gives all who appear before it the opportunity to participate effectively without undue hardship or inconvenience, and so on. And so it's really asking, what does it mean to have an open court? And so I asked students to not only compare Maywood to Wheaton, but to connect all of those different aspects, what it means, open court and best practices with the book. And in fact, Nicole Van Cleve does an incredible job talking about how the courts, right, the inequality of courts, and how some people have easier access to them and other people don't. So my students will even talk about the security process, or finding the courtroom in the courthouse, or down to the parking lot in Maywood. Like, it's harder to find, no one's going to help you, they push you and shuffle you through the system, which looks different in Wheaton. And so I asked them to reflect on why it looks different in Wheaton, also acknowledging kind of who they are and what they're bringing into the environment, right? That many of my students are white middle-class students going to Wheaton, might have a different experience than somebody else. And so those are the some of the examples of how I have used the criminal courts in a variety of different ways. And so Emily's going to talk to you about immigration court.
Okay, great, thank you. So immigration court is a really interesting comparison to some of the courts that Dr. Krieg talked about. And my full disclosure here is that I have attempted to do this multiple times, but due to a pandemic, maternity leave, and a government shutdown, every time I try, this seems to be stymied. But immigration court, like the other court systems, is open to the public. You do not have to notify them ahead of time that you want to go. And so my intention has always been to bring my full class. The one time we've actually been able to do this was in 2019 in January. There was a government shutdown. And I could not do it in January, but a couple students asked me to bring them after the fact. So we ended up going on a field trip with just a handful of students who were really interested, and that's when Dr. Krieg joined us. And it's so that's, again, full disclosure, the only time I've actually been able to get into the court due to the world. But that time was incredibly powerful for students. And I think being able to sit again and watch immigration hearings, especially as Andrea mentioned, if you can do a comparison in terms of how these run versus how other procedures are run, it can be very enlightening. And so, of course, it can help students understand some of these court procedures, what it looks like. It also cultivates a tremendous amount of compassion. The time that we went, we observed several cases, but one not uncommon is that a man was standing there without an attorney. Most immigrants do not have attorneys with them. And so they are trying to defend these really complex legal cases by themselves with clearly not understanding what is happening. And so students witness, you know, the scene where you have somebody who clearly doesn't understand the legal system by themselves, trying to fight for their right to stay in the United States. And that can be incredibly devastating. And I think an incredibly powerful opportunity to help students cultivate compassion for immigrants. And so with that said, it can be helpful for a really wide range of classes. I use it in a class on immigration and Latinos. A class on globalization could be very helpful, but also things like criminal justice, journalism, politics, and among, you know, a wide range of other types of classes. So this is certainly not just about a criminal justice perspective. I think that this can also help cultivate kind of citizenship duties in a way, especially if you're able to work with organizations. There's a wide range of organizations that do accountability of court systems and of immigration court in particular. So they put bodies in the court to help hold the court accountable. So there's organizations like that in the Chicago area where you essentially are a volunteer for the organization as you're sitting in the court. And again, the idea is to have a citizenship accountability, which is one of these justifications for the open court, that we want citizens to be able to say it is running as it should, and we know that because our bodies are in the court. And so I think that there's also this opportunity to promote some of that kind of, again, that kind of duty of citizenship. You could also use this in addition to all the other things that Andrea mentioned earlier in the presentation for something like ethnographic data collection. Obviously, you need IRB approval and you need to go jump through all the hoops. But it's a great way to collect data, especially as a class. If you send students individually on different days and everybody collects their own data, you can come up with some really interesting ethnographic findings. So, oops. I always like to provide my students some resources. Here's just a couple I'll highlight. So Michelle Venata is a professor at Dominican, and her article is actually on the Chicago immigration court system. And so it's a great starting point for students prior to entering it at all. There's certainly a lot of journalistic accounts of journalists who have gone to the immigration system, observing what's happening. One thing I'd like to point out, and perhaps I don't have time to actually go here, but this website, if you just look up Track, it is a website that tracks a lot of immigration data. And one thing that they do is look at judges across the United States and their asylum, the amount of asylum claims that they accept or deny. And so it's really great because you can narrow into the Chicago region and you can click on individual Chicago judges. So if you know whose courtroom you'll be observing ahead of time, you can get an idea of how often that judge passes or accepted asylum claims and how often they deny, especially compared to the nationwide average. And so you'll see some of our judges accept more claims than others. And so you can have students do some of that research ahead of time so they have an understanding of how our court system, our immigration court system, compares to court systems across the country. And I found that to be really useful. So the practical part of this, it's located on Van Buren Street. Parking is very difficult. I really encourage students to take public transportation. Advance notice is not required, but it's very helpful. And so what I have found is that you can contact the regional public information officer. It's very difficult to find her information. And I didn't want to put it on here because it seems like it's perhaps hidden for a reason. I'd be happy to share her information with you. Her name is Gail Montenegro. And I contacted her when my students and I went, and she basically helped us organize, explain what times were best to come in, helped us decide what judges to observe. And then she also gave us a tour and kind of her spiel. Now that spiel didn't necessarily align with some of the things that I teach in my own class. So it's, but it was still interesting. It was good for students to be able to hear from her as basically the PR representative for ICE, for the immigration court, and also as a contrast to kind of how we have discussed things in my class. So I think it can be useful. You do not have to do that. You can show up, but it can be useful, especially if you're organizing a lot of students and you want a lot of students at once. She can help identify where students can go in the best times. I also have the information for the website to get more information about, observing courts and kind of what's happening at justice.gov. So I know that we're almost out of time. We wanted to consider a couple things, or rather, we wanted to talk about a couple of considerations as you're planning. One is simply the ethics of this. And I think that there is a lot to be said for the need to really talk, I think as the professor leading this type of thing, and then with your students, talking through the ethics of observing human suffering, essentially. A lot of what Court Watch is observing people in some of the worst moments of their lives. With immigration court, it is possible that you'll just see people's cases extended. It's possible that you'll see somebody receive their final deportation notice. Truly the worst moment of their life, possibly. And I think that there is an ethical question to be asked about, do we have the right to be there? One of the ways that I try to think through this ethical question, is weighing are the benefits to the students outweighing, as we do with all of our, IRB considerations, do they outweigh the risks and outweigh the drawbacks of observing people in this moment? And I think part of answering this ethical question for me is considering some of these more active participation, active understandings of participation. So court watch as an accountability process, right? So if your body is in the court just to watch, well, that's one thing. But if you are there to actually hold the court accountable as part of your duty as a citizen, perhaps there is an ethical case to be made that it actually is something that we're contributing to society. So I think those are good questions to talk about with your class. A lot of preparation and debriefing needs to go into this in general, especially when you're observing court cases and situations, which can be very traumatic. And so students need to be prepared ahead of time. And I think also debriefed at the end. It was very important for us to talk to students about what they had witnessed, how they felt about it, what that meant for our society, for them, for our personal role as individuals. Perhaps a little bit less important, but still important is communicating court etiquette. So if you work with the liaison there, she'll actually send you a list of, do's and don'ts of being in court. You can also Google those, but it is important ahead of time to let students know, what you're supposed to do as you're in the courtroom. And Andy, if you want to add any more, I'll hand the rest over to you.
Yeah, so a couple other kind of like just logistic things to think about, right? COVID was a game changer and shut the courts down. They got them up and rolling, I would say relatively fast on Zoom. So my students through COVID did do some Zoom court watching, which in itself was interesting to talk about what is open access and what is not open access. And you think that Zoom makes it really easy, but it's actually, you can turn the camera on and turn the camera off and mute in different ways. And so thinking about COVID, transportation, how are your students going to get there? I've planned to take the metro. I've also brainstormed that we could carpool to the blue line and come in, because I thought that taking the L was important. We carpool to Maywood regularly, and I just help facilitate that. Make sure you pay attention to your university's liability. So the students are not allowed to get in my car. They have to carpool with each other instead. The costs, so is it going to cost money for them to get on the train, anything like that? The courts run on their own hours and holidays, so paying attention to some of governmental holidays. The court contacts, Emily, I would say that I think that the person is hard to find because it's bureaucracy and they make it hard to find. So the best of your ability, honestly, calling the court and saying, this is what I want to do, and they transfer you around, has been my best bet on those. Class conflicts, right? Not everybody can go on a field trip. I let my students know that we're doing this at the first week of school. I don't make it required necessarily for them, but they're all so excited to go on a field trip in college that they really do plan around it and get really excited. And so I think I've had maybe one or two students who can't come, and I tell them that I'm happy to write a letter to their other faculty members to say this is real. I'm happy to write to their coach to say this is real, whatever. And then lastly, again, make sure that you're paying attention to the liability of taking your students off campus. We are happy to answer any questions and to share any information. Like Emily said, ethically, Chicago Votes is another organization that's actually doing accountability work right now with the Chicago Appleseed Fund. And so I've been working on trying to figure out how I can wrap our project in with them. So my students' data isn't just coming to me as a paper, but it's actually going to be compiled with like a larger effort. So thank you. And there's our contact information, because we have a couple of minutes for questions, and then you're welcome to email us with anything else.
Oh, I was polite, and then I'm just that kid in the back of the room.
So, hey, I've got a question. Thanks very much for explaining all of this. Incredibly informational. I'm at Trinity Christian College, another small school. Can you give some examples of what students have said after